AP, Choice 106.9 FM and 980 AM WRNA, Gus Praise, Pensacola. On the World Wide, we are streaming at www.wrna980.com. It's time now for You Got the Power with your host, Omar Neal, live.
Well, thank you, Bob, and welcome again to the You Got the Power show. I am your host, Omar Neal. You know, sometimes it's important to understand the whys, because if you don't understand the whys, you don't ask the right questions and you don't get to the right answers. And so there are some whys. Why has racism persisted so long? I mean, even not just from 1619. I'm not talking about the time by which the African-American person was enslaved in this country, but even before that, the mindset that thought that subjugation was okay, and that to extract one substance without compensation would be a human characteristic that would be acceptable. That's what I want to get to. Well, I have a person that's with me today to whom I held in very high esteem, particularly as it relates to dealing with the issue of race relations, looking at the issues of white supremacy, how white supremacy sustains itself over this long period of time. We're going to be talking with Mark A. Potok. Mark is formerly of the Southern Poverty Law Center. He's an author. He is a lecturer. He has spent the majority of his life tracking hate groups, understanding the inner workings of white supremacist organizations and the like. And so I welcome Mark Potok to the You Got the Power program. Welcome, Mark.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Omar. I appreciate it.
You know, Mark, I was looking at the situation with NASCAR recently with Bubba Wallace and this notion of the Confederate flag. And I was wondering, you know, with now all of the Confederate monuments being, well, not all of them, but many of them being taken down and the backlash associated with these monuments, I wanted to ask you, why do these symbols mean so much? Why is that, Mark?
Well, I think in many ways, it boils down to the fact that in the particular case of Confederate symbols, statues, and so on, these were largely put into place in this country in the 19-teens and especially in the 1920s. So these were not put up immediately after the war to honor the great heroes, Robert E. Lee, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and all the rest of that crew. These were the work of the Daughters of the Confederacy, principally, and other neo-Confederate groups, which were very uptight about Black people gaining more and more of their freedom. And they wanted, in effect, to reimpose white supremacy, or at least to frighten people back into their supposed places. So, you know, this was a campaign to glorify the Confederacy and to put, frankly, Black people, African Americans, back in their so-called place. So, you know, the idea that these statues were somehow an organic outgrowth of, you know, this very bitter war that was fought that killed more than 600,000 people in the United States is frankly BS. It was a public relations campaign aimed at essentially rehabilitating not only the Confederacy, but white supremacy in general.
So this was nothing to do with, it had nothing to do primarily with this notion of touting, you know, or at least memorializing these heroes they had, but it was to remind Black people of their inferiority and that white supremacy was still intact, even though they lost the war. That's
right. That's right. At a time when white supremacy was, at least in some small measure, being contested, it was a way of saying, you know, get back, get back, get back, right? I mean, it's that idea that, you know, you better watch it. And, you know, this was at a time, it's maybe worth mentioning, when the Ku Klux Klan was by far larger than it has ever been before or since, larger than the Reconstruction, the so-called First Era Klan, much larger than the Klan of the Civil Rights era, the 1950s and 60s. There were some 4 million members of the Ku Klux Klan in the mid-1920s, and probably some of our viewers will remember, you know, that something like 40,000 Klansmen marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House in this huge show of strength. So, you know, this was a very contentious moment in our history. The Klan was very powerful. There were a lot of proto-fascist groups in this country. This is, you know, before Nazi Germany, of course, but we had already seen the beginnings of real fascist ideology, not only in Europe, but very much in our country as well. So it was a hot time. And these, I mean, let me say, you know, another way of describing what I'm talking about is, you know, what are some of these monuments really like? They're not all, you know, pretty equestrian statues of Robert E. Lee. One statue, it's a cenotaph, an obelisk that I will never forget, which exists and is still standing today, was put up in Colfax, Louisiana, to commemorate and celebrate the brave and heroic sacrifice of 3 white men who led a mob of something like 1,000 whites to murder 150 black men, women, and children who were huddled in a courthouse in the county seat of Colfax. So, you know, and on this obelisk, and as well on a historical sign that was put up later in Colfax, no mention is made of the 150 people who died. It's simply a monument to the heroic work of the 3 unfortunate whites who died in this mob of, calling it like it is, murderers.
So it was 1,000 people go kill 150 people. 3 of them die, and then they place in martyrdom the 3 that died.
Right.
Is what
so, you know, if we're talking about history, you know, oh, you know, Trump says we're erasing history and these beautiful monuments and statues. Well, you know, if it were really history, perhaps the obelisk would mention the 150 who died who were not white. But of course, it didn't, because that was never the purpose of the obelisk in Colfax, Louisiana, or really any of these other statues. It was, in effect, a warning with a gun pointed at those who would defy it.
You know, what's interesting is that Donald Trump went to Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921 race massacre, right? Never mentions it, right? Right, I mean, a block away from where it actually took place, right? And so the question is, you know, I'm kind of looking at the symbolism of going to those spaces where these atrocities took place. Is that also kind of code for we're still here and we're still behind you?
To be honest, I think that Donald Trump is so bloody ignorant that he had no idea what Juneteenth was. He'd never heard of it. No idea about the Tulsa Massacre, the destruction of the Greenwood community, the so-called Black Wall Street of Tulsa. So he's just oblivious, and he's surrounded by a bunch of white advisors who are equally oblivious. So no, I'm not so sure they went there to stick a finger in the eye of Black Americans or anybody who objects to that sort of thing. I just think it reflects the unbelievable ignorance of these people who, God help us, are running our country right now.
You know what's so interesting too, Mark? You know, we talked about, you would think that, you know, at some juncture, generations would shed the lie, right? And would really reconcile with themselves and the truth and begin to move on from that. But you have young people now, you know, are still promoting white supremacist ideology. And I wonder, do they not know what they are promoting is in fact a lie? and that these individuals who they tout as being, worthy of honor, were really treasonous individuals who fought against this country? Do they really understand that?
No, I think in many cases they really don't. Yes, absolutely. Out there in the white supremacist world, the kind of organized white supremacist world, there are people who know perfectly well what happened and think it was great. But in general, answering your question, which I think is a really good question, I would say a part of the reason we are still in the place that we are at is the education of our children, Black, white, and otherwise, in the United States of America, and especially in the South, is abysmal in terms of American history. We have done an absolutely terrible job of explaining anything about our history. So, we've seen in the realm of history this lost cause mythology about the battle of the South being to preserve, dignity and states' rights and liberty and so on, when that is patently false. All one needs to do is look at the various declarations of the causes of secession from states like Virginia, like Alabama, which explicitly said, our mission is the defense, and they said candidly, of white supremacy and of slavery. But, if you have been educated in the last 50 or 60 years, particularly in the South, but to a large extent in the North as well, you would have virtually no idea that that was so. I live in a town in Montgomery, which is actually relatively progressive these days. We have our first Black mayor, who turns out to be a really first-rate mayor, and so on. But, we have Robert E. Lee High School, and that kind of thing escaped everyone's notice for a very long time. I see all this kind of media attention to things like the Fort Pillow massacre, the massacre by Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest of some 150 Black soldiers who were surrendering, right? In other words, it was a war atrocity. Or the destruction of the Black community in Tulsa in 1921. And it goes on and on and on. And, I know about all of these things because, simply because I took the time to educate myself because I was doing this work around white supremacy. But, until 2 weeks ago, there were very few people in the United States who had any idea what happened at Fort Pillow, or the fact that Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederate general that led this war crime, later went on to become the first Grand Wizard, the first national leader of the Reconstruction era Ku Klux Klan. So there's just an enormous amount of ignorance out there. And also our history so much has been, sort of one step forward or maybe 2 steps or 1.5 steps forward and a large step back. So yes, the slaves were freed. But then the South was quote unquote redeemed, and Black people in America were essentially re-enslaved under Jim Crow. The comparison that I think is really worth making is to Germany. Germany, obviously, the Nazi regime was about as bad a regime in the history of mankind as you can get. And yet, Germany, in the years since the end of the Second World War, has done an enormous amount to squarely face its past. Not only with a couple of pro forma apologies, we're really sorry about the Jews and the other 20 or 30 million people we killed, but let's all be friends now. That is not at all what has happened in Germany. People are educated, highly educated about their own country's future. And parenthetically, in terms of the conversation you and I are having about Confederate statues, there's no such thing as a statue in Germany, to some Nazi leader, some National Socialist leader, who maybe was a great doctor on the side or whatever it may have been. So, there are real antecedents, real cases of countries that have had to face the kind of original sin that we have to face, in our case, in terms of slavery. And it's just patently clear that there are so much better ways to deal with this. And, God help us, it seems like maybe we are beginning to turn a corner here. But of course, many of us thought we were beginning to turn a corner after the events in 2016 in Ferguson, Missouri. It didn't come to much in the end. Today does seem a little different to me. And I think one of the principal differences is that you have very large numbers of white people, right? It's not only an
Right.
African-American movement,
Right.
it's really right across the board in
Right.
terms of people. So you hear, I mean, it's remarkable to me to hear people on NPR, or wherever it may be, some nice white suburban lady from somewhere up north who's really thinking about these things for the first time. I heard this particular woman I'm thinking of had a whole spiel she gave about, she raised her children to be, not racist and so on. And I absolutely believe her. But, what she was saying was, so I taught my kids to not see color in as much as that's possible in the world. And I realize now how very wrong that was. Race does matter, whether we like it or not in our country. So I'm saying there's some good signs out there. I'm hoping.
What's so interesting, Mark, is this. Although you attribute much of what the president does to naivete, but I gotta believe that Congress.
Let me interrupt you just to
No.
say, no, I think the president is an out and out racist. I think he is a racist to the core, to the marrow. I just think in the case of Tulsa, that the man didn't know what he was talking about. He just didn't have any idea about Juneteenth and so on. So
you think he's a white supremacist? You think he's a white supremacist?
Fundamentally, yeah. I mean, he's a racist person. Whether he's, when I think of white supremacist in my world, that's more the kind of organized white supremacist, right? I'm leader of the neo-Nazi party. But I mean, my God, putting aside even all the old stuff about, refusing to rent to black people in his buildings in New York City, or calling for the Central Park Five to be put to death in the electric chair, and all those kinds of things. Let's remember that in his campaign at the very beginning, in 2015 and 2016, Donald J. Trump was calling for members of his rallies to beat up black protesters. You may remember he infamously said at one point, "I will pay the defense costs of anyone who beats up these people."
I remember
Incredible.
that. Right. What's interesting? What's the appeal? I mean, he seems to be a phony to me. I mean, he seems to be a Barker. I mean, he seems to be kind of a snake oil salesman. But what's the appeal? I mean, to a person like that in this day and time?
I mean, in a way, that's like asking what's the appeal of white supremacy or those kinds of ideas.
Right.
What I would say about that is, the United States, not to mention much of Europe and much of the rest of the world, is changing in very dramatic ways. And this has been going on for 20 or 30 years now. What I mean is, for instance, the idea that white people will soon, in the next 20 or 25 years, be fewer than 50% of the population. In other words, whites in this country are about to lose their majority. At the same time, there are huge cultural changes like, say, the legalization of same-sex marriage in all 50 states by the Supreme Court, something that seemed kind of unimaginable a while ago. The presidency of Barack Obama, a black man in the White House, economic effects of globalization, where big sectors of workers, auto workers, steel workers, textile plant workers, and so on are being hurt. So what I'm trying to describe is America is changing as a matter of giant historical forces in very serious ways. And there's some group of people out there who, with great nostalgia, think, I look back to the good old days. And of course, the good old days were when, African-American people knew their place, quote unquote, when gay people were in the closet, when women were, fundamentally barefoot and pregnant. So it's a reactionary movement, literally, right? It's reacting to changes in the world that these people don't know how to handle. And it's a very easy thing, or an easier thing, rather than looking at what I'm talking about, these historical forces, globalization, changes in the world. It's much easier to say it is the fault of those thugs, those terrorists, the people who are protesting in the streets against police violence, right? You make an enemy, you identify them, they claim they're standing up for civil rights. No, they're just terrorists, as our president has instructed us.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, Mark, you have such a way of clarifying and simplifying what's happening. I often wonder to what extent have these institutions that we revere been infiltrated by white supremacists. I'm talking about law enforcement. I'm talking about the judges, the judicial system.
Well, more than I thought, I must say. I just wrote a piece for the Daily Beasts about the kind of malevolent power of police unions, and I started out the piece by talking about, how for years I feel like, it wasn't really my mission to do this, but as a part of my job working at the Southern Poverty Law Center, I'd get questions from reporters all the time about, are the various police departments filled with Klansmen and so on. And I spent a lot of time defending police departments from that accusation, because really, as a truthful matter, it wasn't so. Yes, now and then. And, I always tried to say, look, in the 50s and 60s, no doubt about it, right? You look at a police department like the Department of Birmingham, Alabama, you are talking about a clanified, if there's such a word, department. But to get to the point, I think more and more there's evidence, not so much that there are Klansmen in police departments or Klansmen in the military, or even in the judiciary, but people who sometimes think an awful lot like Klansmen. So, I don't think it's so much an organized infiltration of our institutions, although in a few cases that's true, as it is that there are people in these institutions who are fundamentally racist in a very deep way. And I think that comes out, you see that even now during all these Black Lives Matters demonstrations. It seems like every day there's some story about a county commissioner or a board of education member from somewhere making some incredible statements about, the protesters in particular. They should all be killed, they should be shot, they should be executed, they're traitors, and so on. So,
I often wonder, how can you sustain a system like that if you don't have people who at least are sympathizers to that particular ideology in order to create and to maintain the culture, right? So, that's why I was saying, is it that there's been infiltration, whether or not they associate themselves with some organized group? At least the thought and the ideology of white supremacy is prevalent in those institutions or organizations.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. And, I would point to the military in particular, in which it's more true, certainly than in the case of police departments, that, in the world of white supremacists, of organized white supremacy, there have been quite a number of people over the last 20 years or so who have urged their followers to join the military, if possible, to get into the special forces, the best military training in the world, arguably, or as one of these people, a leader of a particular neo-Nazi group, wrote not so long ago, if you can't get into special forces, go into the infantry, because in the infantry, you will learn the skills that will be needed in the coming race war. So, yes, there has been genuinely a kind of semi-organized attempt to infiltrate the military. The military generally has acted pretty well about this. I mean, as one who demonstrated against the Vietnam War and so on when I was a very young man, it's a bit, shocking to me to hear myself say this, but, in some ways the military has stood up very well in the last few years. I mean, one sign of that is that there is a far higher rate of interracial marriage within the American military than in any other sector of society. And that's because, at least to a large extent, the military promotes this idea of a real meritocracy, right? You rise by your individual merits, not because you're the friend of the son of the captain or, the commander or whatever it may be, or because you have a nice white skin, unlike the guy standing next to you. So, I don't mean to paint a Pollyannish picture of the military. I don't think that's so, but there have been both efforts to infiltrate it by organized white supremacists, but also, a pretty decent, by and large, push for more democratic ideas among the leadership of the military.
One thing that you raised that makes a lot of sense to me is that, and this is something that others have, you're not the first that I've heard say this, is that there's a deep fear that because of the changing and shifting in the demographics in this country and the world, right, and the inevitable or inevitability of white people becoming the quote unquote minority, that this is frightening to them, and that so therefore this is a kind of it's kind of the what do you call it, the last breath. It's like the death rattle of this white supremacy. It normally it becomes more pronounced when
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that.
when the fear with
Well,
social.
it's the idea of a backlash, right? I think that's the fundamental thing, right?
What the black people
Things are changing.
Do you think black people are going to do to them what they did to us? Is that the fear?
I don't think that's it. I mean, I don't think that's a realistic expectation at all. But I think that it is, down here in the South where we both live, I
Right.
mean, if you tell a white person, say something about white privilege, that's felt as an attack. It's like, what do you mean white privilege? I have to work for a living and nobody helped me out. And, I've got it tough and in this way and that way and the other way. And, so perhaps it's a pretty normal human instinct to say, what do you mean? I didn't get the job because I'm the boss's son. I got the job because I worked hard for it. So there's a kind of defensive reaction. But when people are challenged in that way, I mean, right now, as the story I told earlier seemed to indicate, there are quite a number of people who are facing, who are grappling with the idea of white privilege, but that's almost brand new. I mean, yes, there's some awareness of white privilege. There has been for years, on the left and among kind of very young people, college students and so on. But when you're talking about kind of the broad masses of white people, white working people out there, they have been very, very resistant to any kind of acceptance of that reality. And I do think that, the video of all of these events, the fact that everyone has a cell phone with a camera in it, has been incredibly powerful. What would have, could we imagine what has happening if the murder of George Floyd had not been videoed in the way it was, with the incredible arrogance of Derek Chauvin, the murderer, sitting there with his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and looking at the camera, with a great big FU look. I mean, there's just this arrogance and you think you're going to stop me? I'm the boss here. Anyway.
Well, what's interesting too, Mark, is that I think that it was, even in the 60s, it was the camera that rallied the people when they saw on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Bloody Sunday, right? It was the cameras that captured that quickened the empathy and sympathy of the nation to rise to the occasion to address that issue. In fact, I was going to have Miss Lewuso's daughter on with you, but we'll get her on later, and some more people who lost their lives who were white people, right? Viola Lewuso's daughter was going to be on, and Andrew Goodman's brother, David Goodman. I was going to have them on with you. I thought that would be really good. Somebody like you, who understood white supremacy, and they went in to try to fight it and lost their lives. So I want to ask you this, and you mentioned this before, because in my lifetime, Mark, I'm not felt this hopeful that maybe we're turning a corner. Now one of the things, I'm not naive, and this is not Pollyannish. I don't want to come across like that, because I know that there are people who will do window dressing, right? Like the Republican Party is now with the police reform, that a lot of times they'll do something, although they know it won't, substantially alter what's going on, but they say they did something to kind of pacify you, right? And appease you so that you can go away. But somehow I don't feel that the young people will settle for some cursory response to this moment. What's your take on that?
I'm with you. You know, I mean, I know something about our history, so of course that makes you extremely reluctant to say this is the beginning of the end of white supremacy. But I just don't think there's any difference. I've been thinking a little bit because, as I mentioned earlier, I've been thinking about the '60s, and you know, I was born in 1955, so in 1968 I was 13 years old and a little hothead, and you know, I thought the cops were terrible, and you know, all that kind of thing. Um, so I've been thinking a little bit about then versus now, and you know, at the time I was 13, incredibly, you know, naive in some ways, ignorant in others, but you know, I think essentially on the right side. And back then I felt like the whole world was, it was an uprising, right? And that by God, all the old coots who ran the country, the racists who ran the country and so on, were on their way out. You know, now I look back and realize that, you know, it was actually a fairly narrow movement. You know, there was the Vietnam War, opposition to the Vietnam War. There was, of course, the years following the end of the Civil Rights Movement after King's assassination. You know, and the world was changing in some ways. But really, the so-called counterculture and all that came out of that was, you know, included a very narrow slice, a very narrow wedge of the whole population. So what I'm trying to get to is this idea that it seems much broader based now. You know, I think that when you have something like, you know, masses of white suburban middle class and upper middle class women deserting Trump and coming to see Trump as what he is, a racist, that is very, very hopeful. So, you know, I look at these demonstrations and I see they're not only young people, they're not only Black people, they're not only immigrants, right? They're, you know, it's really, I think, by and large, very representative of the country as a whole. So
Do you think they're really abandoning him? He's kind of held his 35 to 45% the whole time, regardless of, you know, we had the COVID-19, 120,000 people dead, over 2 million people contracting it. Many would say, based on his dereliction and just incompetence, that put us in this position different from anywhere place else in the world, right? And so, but yet and still, he still has his core group. And that's just, I understand. And the other thing, help me out with this, Mark. You know, what is the fear associated with the political leadership? They seem to be sycophants. I mean, you know, they just pander and kowtow down to him. And I don't understand that. You know, help me out with this. You know, I'm always asking you these questions because I know you look into this kind of stuff.
Well, one thing I would point out about the polling, the 36, 37, 38% who support Trump, is a poll I looked at just a week or two ago showed that his, however they phrase it, you know, the strong support, we're, you know, strongly in support of Trump. In other words, the real core group of Trump diehards is now at about 21%. And that has gone down, and gone down fairly dramatically, 7 or 8 points just in the last weeks. So, you know, that tells you something, that the coalition, or whatever you want to call it, of people who support Trump is weakening. It's true that it's still at whatever, 38% or something who would say they would vote for him, depending on what poll you look at. But I think that is being peeled away. And that brings me really to answer the second part of your question, which is about these sycophantic Republicans, right? The kind of, you know, the Lindsey Grahams of the world, the Mitch McConnells of the world, the people who don't seem to be able to find it within themselves to point out the obvious ignorance and just vileness of the man who holds the Oval Office in this country. So I think that's what's happening. I think that, you know, so to actually, really, I mean, you know, so I think that these are Republicans who more and more and more are seeing their base shrinking, and they're kind of reacting the way that Trump has reacted, which is pitching the message more and more directly to the real hardcore, right? The real open racists and so on.
Are they any different from him? Are they any different from him? I mean, you know, we talk about whether or not they support him. Well, maybe.
Well, the difference is they're not the devil, but they'll sell to the devil. right? So,
What's the
a little bit
difference?
of difference in that sense.
I mean, that's nuanced. I mean, it's like you're complicit, right? So, there's sins of omission and commission, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't give any of them a break.
Yeah.
Right up to the Lisa Collinses, the Susan Collinses of the world in
Right,
Maine.
right.
I mean, that they are complicit. And, I mean, Susan Collins infamously said, she thought Trump had learned his lesson. And, that turned out to be patently false and wrong. So, but, the reality is that these people are opportunists. They're weaklings, right? They can't, I mean, do you remember John F. Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Back from when we were kids, right?
Right,
And these were politicians who stood up and quote unquote did the right thing in one way or another,
Mm-hmm.
despite what that was going to mean for them electorally. And you do not see that in the Republican Party anymore, with almost no exceptions.
Well, it's interesting is that there is a watershed moment. There's an inflection point, and I think we're here. But it was Dr. King in his last admonishment to us that says, "Where do you go from here, chaos or community?" I want to ask you that question. Where do we go from here? Look in your crystal ball, Mark. Where do we go from here, chaos or community?
Well, I mean, my hope is that, I have no doubt that there's going to be, conflicts and roiling and boiling and so on for years into the future. But my hope, in addition to the immediate hope of that we're going to see real reform of police department, of policing in this country, is that as this demographic change kind of is completed, right? That white people, newly in a minority like every other minority in the country, will more and more come to accept the world as it is and to embrace it, as you say, in a real community, in the so-called beloved community or whatever. And I think that there's real evidence to suggest that that's a very likely outcome. And what I'm thinking of when I say that is principally the idea that, for instance, if you poll people today, many polls have been done, and ask young people today about their attitudes towards interracial marriage, for example, the people who are opposed to it are like 4%. In other words, given the margin of error, practically zero. And that is absolutely not true of older generations. So, I think that gives you a sense of where we're going, or at least a hopeful window on where we may be going.
There's such things as called, kind of forecasting and kind of targeting where you're going. I was listening to the current occupant of the White House that said that this election, based on the fact that we're talking about absentee voting, is going to be rigged. So is he kind of forecasting that there's not legitimacy in advance, so that he can do whatever to contest what he sees as inevitable outcomes of him losing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two possible answers to that question. The scarier one is the guy really does not intend to give up his office and, may try and call the National Guard into the streets to surround the White House or whatever. In other words,
Michael Cohen said that. Michael Cohen said that,
right.
Mark, he said that he thinks he would do that, that he's
well,
that kind of person.
It seems possible. The man is unhinged. But, or perhaps more benign interpretation is, Trump is this character who cannot stand being perceived as a quote unquote loser. And so, he's just laying the groundwork for, I lost the election, but it was all a lie, right? It was all rigged. So he can still, strut around his, palace in New York or Florida or wherever it is he's going to be living. And say, I'm no loser, right? I mean, you can see how he can't bear that, right? I mean, the Tulsa rally, the 6,200 people in the 19,000 seat stadium was really a remarkable moment. And to me, the most remarkable part of it all was seeing Trump step off that Black Hawk helicopter back in Washington. And, he looked like he wanted to go, lie in his mommy's lap and cry for a while. He did not look good.
Didn't have his tie was down. I mean, I'd never seen him like that.
It was really something. He
like
had that MAGA cap clutched in his hand. It was all crumpled up.
Yeah.
And he looked like in rough shape.
I mean, and I guess there is some humor in some of this, but the point of the matter is, we are, with what's happening with the COVID-19, we have some very serious issues. We have still states like ours who have not reached the peak and continue to climb in terms of infection rates, right? Uh, and there are people who have now made wearing a mask a political issue. I mean, tell me, how did we get to that, Mark, where we're saving my life? And even if I feel some level of invincibility, right? At least I want to save the life of my mother or my grandmother or my aunt, because they may be more vulnerable than I, right? I mean, when do we get to that point of selfishness based on being, hyper partisan?
I mean, it's totally enraging. How do we get to that point? Well, in the same way that Donald Trump has demonized the media is the enemy of the people. And that's why they lie to us all the time, right? That's why they tell us, fake news, like there were, fewer people at Trump's his inauguration than there were at Obama's, right? And that's, it's all a lie by the nasty media, which is trying to destroy America. Well, in the same way, of course, Trump and people in the Republican Party very much like Trump have been for years on a kind of jihad against science, right? So it's science becomes the enemy. And, look at the way Dr. Fauci's been treated, like he's an enemy of the people. So I think this is, there are a lot of people out there who are influenced by what the President of the United States of America says, and particularly if they're relatively uneducated or don't watch a lot of news, but they hear that it's all BS, right? There's no such thing.
So 120,000 people dead, that's BS? I mean,
you look at some of these people and they're telling us the numbers are faked, or that they're, that somehow the media or the medical authorities are wildly exaggerating this. And, it's mind blowing when you think.
I'm talking to funeral home directors that can't hardly process the number of bodies that's coming.
And think of Trump going to Arizona a couple of days ago.
Right, that's my point.
He went to speak in Arizona to a bunch of people in a closed auditorium, almost none of whom wore masks, where he ranted and raved. And he gave this talk in Oklahoma, this sort of unhinged talk attacking all of his enemies, on the very day that Arizona reported the highest number of COVID infections ever in that state, the highest number in a single day ever. And, Trump goes there, he literally breaks the law, breaks the regulations by refusing to wear a mask, and then rants on and on and on about things that are utterly untrue. So,
what's interesting?
It's shocking.
What's interesting, Mark, is because it's not relegated to it, though, a certain group of people who are, of a political persuasion. It affects all of us directly or indirectly, because one is, if you're out, you can, and this is highly contagious, as we're saying, it contracts very easily, right? If you're out, you can infect people who you don't know, and so it has to be some kind of reckoning that says that we have to save our own selves, right? By insisting that our leadership make it mandatory for people who are in certain spaces to wear protective covering over their face, their mouth, and nose, right?
I completely agree. I really think this is the moment for some real political leadership. And, I mentioned Stephen Reed a while ago, the fairly new mayor of Montgomery, Alabama, where I live. And, the council here couldn't get it together to say the obvious, which is you need to wear a face mask when you're in public places that are enclosed. They went to a 4-4 vote, couldn't seem to get up the gumption to say, no, it's not a question of, freedom, whether or not you wear a mask. It's a question of basic human decency and caring for your neighbors, and as you say, your own mother.
Mhm.
And, Reed stepped forward and by executive order imposed a mask requirement. And, I just think that, and so I go out from time to time, I've got to go to the grocery store, and things have changed here in Montgomery. I mean, if you went to Walmart here 2 weeks ago, 2/3 of the people were unmasked, and there wasn't any remote attempt to socially distance within the Walmarts. That's changed. You go to the same Walmart I'm talking about, and now every single person, every single worker has a mask. So, that is, in this case, entirely thanks to the political leadership of the mayor of Montgomery. And, if we had more of that and less of, a president who sits in his Oval Office tweeting out, liberate Ohio, liberate Michigan. In other words, throw out all the COVID regulations and let everybody get back together and infect each other, we would be in a much better place.
I also don't want to make this completely racial, because there are a lot of Black people who I've seen him not wearing masks. And I don't know if they don't understand that. One is that we're disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. The mobility of this particular disease, it impacts us at a greater level than anybody else. And so you would think that we would have a heightened level of sensitivity to that and be in compliance with wearing masks more than anyone else. I mean, certainly everyone should, but we are disproportionately impacted, so we should do it more so. So I'm not going to make that just a racial thing. That's something that we got to do even within the African American.
That's right. And let me say, I think a part of what's going on there, yeah, you would think, right? The people of color are much more, Black people in particular, are much more severely impacted. But, I think what you see is kind of the same in all races, which is that young people, you're 18, 19, 20, 21, you're strong as can be, right? You're never going to be any stronger in any better shape than you are then. And you feel invulnerable, right? A little flu can't knock you down, plus you have the kind of foolishness of youth, right? I mean, it doesn't seem possible, right, that anything could kill you. And, it's well known, according to actual studies, that young people take chances, take risks, that, it's like their brains haven't fully developed yet. So I think it's a lot of it has to do with youth and just the kind of blessed ignorance of youth. And that is not in any way specific to African American youth. It's true of white youth and every other group as well.
Let me take a couple of phone calls. 8483. You got the power. What's your comment?
Yes. Thank you so much for taking my call. And I want to say to your guests, sir, thank you for all you have done through the years seeking justice in an unjust society. Let me say this. My niece has COVID-19. She's quarantined at home. My fear is that because the public housing area that she lives in, no one wanted to be tested because, as your guest just said, the people between the age of, say, 14 and 26, they just don't believe they could catch it. But I've been listening to your whole show, and I'm glad I'm not the only one that think that this president is unfit to serve. And I just want to close by encouraging every citizen of goodwill and good conscience, please vote this guy out of office.
Okay. Thank you so much for giving me a call. I appreciate you. We're talking with Mark Potok. Mark has been on the show for many years. He's formerly of the Southern Poverty Law Center. I guess that's kind of, I always say that, Mark, although you've done other things in your life, it's kind of your claim to fame for me, because that's where I met you. And you've done so much great work on really giving clarity to what was happening in terms of racism and understanding these institutions that undergird social deviance and subjugation of people. And I really do appreciate, I tell you this all the time, whether or not we're on the air or not, I really, really appreciate you. And it's going to take people like you. And I want to go to this space because you did say this, and I believe this. I believe that when white people say that they're tired of it, when they get like Fannie Lou Hamer, Mark, and say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, I think that's when the tides will turn. And not just sympathy for Black people. We don't need sympathy. What we need is fairness and equity and opportunity, just like everybody else. It was Dr. King that when I go back to this, it makes all the sense in the world. He said, I want my children to live in a country where they are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And we talked about having some kind of meritocracy in the military. I think that's what everybody wants. Just allow us to be the true and perfect manifestation of God's intent for us without you inhibiting it with some structural racism.
I think that's right. And, I think that what has happened through much of our history is that white people, even to the extent, look, the abolitionists were basically white people from the North, right? Before the Civil War and in the aftermath. So it's not like this country has never had people who are white who recognize injustice in this country and have worked to fix it. But there has been among the broad masses of white people, including many of the abolitionists, the feeling that we just need to, it's kind of a technical fix, right? We need to, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and now will Black people please stop complaining? Now we settled it. So in other words, there's been this very strong feeling among a lot of whites, I'm sure the majority of whites for most of our history, that, okay, we'll do a little of this, a little of that, we'll fix a little of this and that, but then we don't want to hear about it anymore. So, when they're confronted with, in 68, 67, riots in most of the big cities in the United States, or when they see a few people looting during the Black Lives Matter protests and so on, it's, I'm finished. It's all over, right? And, these people are terrible and this all ought to have been settled long ago. And, you saw that very strongly, I think, in the immediate aftermath of Barack Obama's first election, as our first Black president, mixed race president, whatever, right? There was this widespread feeling among whites that, okay, it's done. Please don't talk to me about race anymore. Don't talk to me about white
we've done our part. So
yeah, don't talk to me about policing.
You didn't get just one term. You got 2 terms. All right. So that's it.
It's over. It's over. Don't talk to me about race anymore. And that turned out to be, beyond naive. It was so ignorant. And in fact, the polling shows very clearly that anti-Black attitudes among white people in America went up fairly dramatically during the 8 Obama years. That is remarkable, I think, especially because it seems to me, any reasonable measure, Barack Obama was a very good president and hardly an antagonistic one, right? Hardly antagonistic towards white people, or right? It wasn't like he was there as the representative of African Americans, and to hell with everybody else. That wasn't at all what he was. He was a sensible, kind, reasonable, and intelligent man trying to do the best job he could. And I don't mean to. I'm not writing a hagiography of Obama. He's not the perfect man, but he had done nothing to excite that, right? And yet, simply the sight of this Black man with his Black wife and his Black children in the White House was enough to, among broad masses of white people, to excite this kind of anger, this rage, this increased willingness to say things that are just patently racist by any definition.
Mark, help me out with this, because I noticed that sometimes things can not always be what they appear, right? I sometimes think that President Trump is a distraction, right? Because during the time when he has all his antics, right, over here, watch this, and the judges are being, right, appointed here for lifetime appointments, right? Over here, that to solidify their stronghold in the judiciary was critically important. Is that make sense, or am I overreading this?
Well, no. I think that what has happened with the judiciary is a tragedy. I mean, this is something that's going to be with us for a very long time. Once in a while you get a little hope. For instance, the Supreme Court decision on it's not okay to discriminate against LGBT people in employment was remarkable. And, of course, there were a couple of Trump appointees who voted in favor. That's not true. One Trump appointee, Kavanaugh, did not vote for it. But yes. But as a sort of citizen of the country, as a normal everyday person, we don't get to vote on Supreme Court nominees. We don't get to make appointments. So it's critically important for us to vote for politicians who will not install the kinds of people who are really causing damage to our judicial system. I mean, quite apart from the judges, I look at Bill Barr, and the man, frankly, seems like a gangster, running the Justice Department on behalf of his pal Donald Trump and his friends, right? So you commit a crime that Donald Trump thinks is okay, not a problem, right? It's either a pardon or we're just going to drop the charges against you. So yeah, I mean, there are many things to be concerned about. I mean, he's done a lot of damage. That's going to last. And even some of the more temporary things, I suppose if Biden were to win, he could roll back some of the terrible things that Trump has done with the EPA pretty quickly. But, there's an enormous amount of regulations that are important to the welfare of the people of the United States that have to be fixed. And it's going to take quite a little while to undo, some of the really wide-ranging damage that Trump has done. And, the other piece of the damage from my point of view that Trump has done is he has made it socially okay, at least to some extent, to voice these kinds of opinions. Like, the police union official who recently said, I'm tired, and me paraphrasing, of course, but, he's tired of all this bitching and moaning about too many Black people being shot by police. In fact, the statistics show that we ought to be shooting 24% more than we're shooting now, right? It's an incredible statement, and yet a police officer who's an official in the police union is perfectly willing to make it and make it publicly. And that, in my opinion, is very largely due to the normalization of those kinds of really loathsome ideas by the commander-in-chief, our president.
It's interesting. John Bolton just came out with his new book. Obviously, people are saying that he is a traitor for not testifying before Congress in impeachment proceedings. So to use it for, profit, the information that may be important for us to know what kind of president we have, is too little, too late. But let's put that aside. He literally said that this country cannot come back from 2 terms of Donald Trump. I mean, this is what he said. And obviously he was sitting at the table. He watched him very closely. I don't, his political and ideological philosophy is probably polar opposite in mine. But I don't think he's lying in that regard. What's your take on that?
I think that's right. I think that, Bolton, in my opinion, is a loathsome character and always has been, but for different reasons. I do think he tells the truth. I've never seen anything to indicate the guy lies. He's just the opposite, right? I mean, he'll make these amazing statements about, invading Iraq or Iran and so on. So yes, and he's not a stupid man either. So I think that there is that's something to be taken seriously. The idea that this country cannot stand another 4 years. And, it's just as we've been talking about, the appointment of judges, the changing of regulations, the politicization of the Justice Department, the politicization of the military, right? All of these are incredibly damaging to institutions that are really important to maintaining any kind of real democracy. So, yeah, I think it's really scary. Of course, I'm hopeful. Everything seems difficult to believe that Trump could win another term, but he's pulled it out before. And, the prospect that, for instance, not enough young people vote because they're still, pining away after Bernie Sanders or whoever it might be is frightening. So, you know, I would urge all people out there, it's incredibly important that we vote. You know, we hold in our hands not merely the next 4 years, but the future of our country. You know, are we going to be a democracy, or are we going to be, you know, the Philippines?
Right. Let me bring on 3660 for a quick comment or statement. 3660, you got the power. Hello?
Omar Neal?
Yes, that's
Is this
go ahead.
Omar Neal?
Yes.
This is Professor Judy Purnell, retired African Studies.
How you doing, Dr. Purnell? How you doing?
Oh, listen, I'm great. I'm listening to you. One of the things I wanted to say in reference to what's happening in this country right now, I have been talking to congressional reps in reference to 45 and the next election. The only way we can correct this country is to modify have a modification of the Constitution. That is to change the requirements for a person to be president and come up with qualification standards. 45 has truly and pure indicated through his actions what a person would do that is not qualified to be president. And because they don't have qualification standards written for him, that means that people can do damn near, excuse my language, or anything that they want to. So in order to correct a situation, why not deal with what really, or why we have 45 now as president? Because the only qualification was 35 and natural born.
Right.
We need to come up so that we can measure with be measurable with the rest of the world.
Okay. Thank you so much. That would and that's good. You know, Mark, I think she's right. That maybe we have to. You know, no one thought we would ever elect somebody like him. I mean, that wasn't even possible. That the vetting process would be through the, you know, the primaries and that each party would have some safeguards. And then they thought that even the electoral college would kick in if somebody was just that incompetent and not suitable. So, but maybe you're right, Dr. Purnell. Maybe we need to look at that. That's something that I like to have that conversation. In fact, I like to have that conversation with you. Let's talk about it. I like to bring you onto the show as well, so we can talk about that. I think that's a solution. That's not just talking.
It is a solution for the future of this country.
Right.
See, one of the things people are looking at is what's happening right now. You know, when the Constitution was written, that was only in reference to it favored white males. Now we've got a complicated world society. We can't have someone who's incompetent. You have to have a background in international relations, understand political science, politics in general, know the names of the presidents and whatever. I get upset when I talk about this.
You know,
because I know
Dr.
that
Purnell, I have gone over 2 minutes, and the radio station is going to kill me for that.
Okay, let me get up.
Let me say this. I don't want a competent racist in office either. So I mean, so we're gonna have to figure out a way to just do, because you can be competent.
Education.
You know,
we got to deal with.
Yeah, we got so much to do. Let's do this. Mark Potok, man, it's so wonderful hanging out with you. You can come on my show anytime you want to, and I so appreciate the work you do, because people get a great understanding because of your candor. You know, I mean, I've every question that I've ever asked you, Mark, I think you honestly tried to answer it as purely as you could, without, you know, feelings of even you're dealing with your whiteness, right? Even to point to the deficiencies and the ill activities and behavior of white people. You've been willing to do that, and I'm greatly appreciative for you to come on the show.
Well, all I can say is thank you so much. I mean, you've said many kind things to me, and I appreciate it, and hope the work does. You know, I mean, it's an easy time to feel discouraged on the one hand. It's an easy time to feel encouraged as well. So, you know, God willing, right? We'll go forward. You know, I still think that this country is filled with, you know, pretty decent people. It's a pretty good shot at making a nation. But we need to be an awful lot better than we are. And it's something that's going to take every one of us. And in any case, I'm really happy to come on the show anytime.
Thank you so very much. Mark Potok, formerly of the Southern Poverty Law Center, as well as the book. Mark, what's this book you got out? Tell me what the book.
No, I don't have a book out. I've been doing a lot of writing for the Daily Beast, and of course, I've written articles.
So I just want them to read your writing. That's what I'm saying. So the Daily Beast is where they can go.
Yeah, well, I have a lot of my writing compiled on I have a little website. It's markpotok.net, N-E-T. And, if you click through, I have something about recent writings and appearances. And there I have links to most of what I've done over the last 3 years or 3 or 4 years since I left the center.
Okay, good. All right, Mark Potok, my guest for today. Thank you all so much for joining with us on this segment of You Got the Power. It's been a wonderful show. I went over. I will apologize to the radio station for that. But sometimes it takes this moment, and I hope that they will be gracious with me and not penalize me too much for this. But we appreciate your coming on and joining with us on this segment of You Got the Power, as well as we'd like for you to support this program. And this is how you can do it. You can send your checks and money orders in care of You Got the Power at P.O. Box 146, Tuskegee, Alabama, 36087. That's P.O. Box 146, Tuskegee, Alabama, 36087. Also, you can support us on PayPal as well as Cash App on our Facebook page. And we got our t-shirts coming out first part of July. Our You Got the Power t-shirts will be out. You want to make sure you pick up one of those as a part of supporting the You Got the Power program. As always, I like to leave you with these 2 words. Remember that I love you with a perfect love. But more importantly, remember this. You got the power. We'll see you next week, same time, same station. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.